a commitment to religious liberty, certainly coming from the Judeo-Christian heritage, is a commitment to religious liberty for all.
Yes.
It's not just me and my group.
Yeah.
It means I have to give it to others. I have to give it to Aboriginal people or to other people who I don't believe. And I would even say you have to give a liberty of conscience to people who have no religious belief as well. So that, I think that's a really important point. And that then cuts it. It comes into love your neighbour, doesn't it? It comes from love your neighbour, I think.
Yes.
And it cuts against the sort of the grasping, thrusting model of too much modern life, which is I and my group are going to fight to get the power to make the laws or whatever it is that we want. So it's this model, isn't it, saying, no, what I would like for me and my group, I must give to others as well, even if I disagree with them.
Yes.
The same freedom that I have, they should have too.
Yes. Yeah. And actually, Mark, I think one of the great illustrations of this in Australian history is an illustration where it's actually the case that a religious liberty argument has been used to protect people of no particular belief, and that is with the idea of conscientious objection to military service. So in 1903, Australia's Defence Act protected those who conscientiously object to go to war on the basis of religious grounds. So religion, varying forms, but any kind of religion was mentioned. Then there were two subsequent revisions to that Commonwealth Act over the next 2 decades. And those revisions removed the word religion and basically just protected it as a conscientious, a right of conscience, like a freedom of conscience, and therefore a kind of free exercise. But I think that actually is a great illustration of, John, what you were saying earlier, which is that these ideas about freely kind of loving and protecting the rights of others, regardless of whether they're fellow believers or of no belief whatsoever, because with the Commonwealth Defence Act example, you could be an atheist who happens to be a pacifist. They are so entwined with Australia's history and values that actually they protect all people. And this is something we've kind of forgotten when in contemporary debate we tend to just think that it's really only about a bunch of Christians.
Yeah, so you talked there about loving and protecting those around you, your fellow citizens, but that's not the talk now. The talk is all about empowerment. It's all about power. People want political power for the sake of the political power, to lord it over somebody else, not to build a fairer, more merciful, more just society.
Where everyone can flourish. Yeah.
Where everyone can flourish. We need to take a big reality check. Can either of you have a perspective on how did this happen? How did we lose this heritage? See, historians will tell you, you're a historian, that societies rise and fall. There's nothing unusual about that. They achieve greatness usually on the basis of shared common belief and what have you, rising prosperity, more learning. Yeah. And then they start to become self-indulgent, self-centred, lose an understanding of the common good and a commitment to the common good. Is that what's been happening in Western societies and in Australia?
I think, look, there is an extent to which that's true, and there's a number of, I think, very profound historical explanations of this, what's really broadly a kind of like history of ideas, in the sense of like history of how Western societies like Australia have understood themselves over the past couple of centuries. I think it's really important to point out, though, that one of the kind of, and this again, it's oversimplifying, very complex kind of process that historians like Carl Trueman, also philosopher like Alistair McIntyre has written about this, and also philosophers like Charles Taylor who talk about secularisation. I think one of the most important processes that they identify in this respect is the way that modern society, coming to modernity, modern societies, when you lose a kind of transcendent narrative and a shared transcendent narrative that makes sense of and tells a story about who you are and gives you a sense of principles, what you're left with is, in Alistair McIntyre's description, a kind of they're just competing value systems. So there's no common ground to which people can appeal to make sense of themselves. I think to some extent, and Taylor's got a different kind of explanation of this, but I think to some extent this is helpful here because you talked about like, why is there this obsession of explaining everything in terms of power? And I find even as a scholar intellectually, there is definitely I've seen in scholarship, historical scholarship, that there's a trend in which everything is really understood to be about power. It's unmasking power. And I think to some extent, the recourse to understanding things purely in terms of power, and I think like Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, was kind of right about this, is that when you lose that kind of overarching transcendent narrative, all you're left with is kind of describing plays of power. It's all about power because you've lost, and you, as a society, you're tacitly admitting there is no transcendent narrative. So all you have is a kind of will to power. That's a very great simplification of, I think, a very complex set of processes and a constellation of historical processes over the last few hundred years. But I think that kind of secularization and that loss of an overarching shared narrative to which we can appeal to talk about principles, to talk about a shared set of values, is definitely a part of this.
It's almost back to the future, isn't it? The sort of the pre-Christian idea, because the whole point about Christianity is you've got this story of Christ as God humbling himself to a cross, not exercising power, surrendering it completely, and submitting to the abuse of misapplied, unfairly applied law. Abuse, really. It's counterintuitive for us because of our essential pride and our desire to lord it over others.
All humans are selfish, and that means all societies have a tendency towards selfish advancement of individuals and groups. And what you need is a very strong counter-narrative, which is built around the common good, the need for everyone to flourish, those conditions to be there, not just for me and for my group, which becomes the elite, but for all groups. And that's always been hard for humans in societies, I think, to do that. But the societies that have flourished have been the ones that have managed to do that and give not just power to the elite, but give space for a whole variety of people to live their best lives. That's what my teenage children say. But live a life in accordance with their own conceptions of what makes them of human flourishing. It's difficult, but unless we try it, unless we keep persevering with it, we just end up in a war of all against all, where we struggle for power, don't we? And so the Marxists and the critical theorists and so on have gone there, and it's infecting the perceptions of many disciplines, and including history, and from what I hear you saying. But it's ultimately a destructive route, isn't it? Because there is no way out of that other than to say, well, I mean, I'll be interested in your opinion. There seems to be no way out of that other than to say, my group has the best ideas, we should run the show, you're bad, go away. I mean, if it's a competition for power and that's all it is, because I think I'm right, but there's no way for me to negotiate what is the right or the good with you other than to say, I've got it and you don't, then we're just into a power struggle, aren't we? And that becomes destructive of societies.
Yes.
Well, it takes you back to the law of the jungle.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think importantly, historically, it's important to point out that, look, unmasking power and talking about power relationships is, of course, and I know that you're not saying that that's not an important thing to point out, and that
But it's not the totality of the narrative of human history, is it, or society? Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.